This podcast is sponsored by PACs. Whether on water, on land or in the air, PACs bags are both versatile and flexible backpacks that are perfectly suitable for your requirements in the most demanding of environments. PACs bags are highly regarded due to their exceptional performance in pre-hospital and in critical care environments. Renowned for their durability, they endure harsh conditions while providing rapid and reliable access to essential kit. So their well-organised compartments and customisable configurations enhance efficiency in high-stress situations. PACs bags are designed with infection control in mind and are easy to clean and disinfect. Their highly visible colours and reflective strips add quick identification and adherence to quality standards, assuring reliability. The versatility of PACs bags caters to a diverse EMS providers, but also delivers vital equipment and durability and ease of use for pre-hospital critical care services globally. I've used PACs bags in a number of critical care situations and they're absolutely excellent. Please see the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy network.
Welcome back to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast. In this conversation, we're going to examine the International Journal of Paramedicine with Mic Gunderson. So what we want to do is really unpack the journal just from a point of Mic's original vision for the journal, but also the reach of the journal and the different sections of the journal yet to launch. We're also going to examine the interaction with the journal as it looks from a creative discussion perspective and indeed research ideas and how people can get involved in the journal team. We're also going to look at the anatomy of the journal and indeed some of the specific aims and scopes of the journal. So to do this, I have Mic Gunderson with me. Mic has been involved in EMS since 1975 in various clinical, teaching, leadership and consulting roles. So he's currently the president of the Centre of Systems Improvement. He's the EMS Quality Academy and Chief Strategy Officer for Cambridge Consulting Group. Mic also serves as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Paramedicine, which is published by the National EMS Management Association in the United States. Mic, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Owen. Appreciate being here.
I just wondered if we could start and kick off, Mic, by really just broaching why we should publish academic work in relation to pre-hospital care in the first place.
Well, academic journals are where the science really happens. It's where the science is originally published. It's consumed there by people not only in our own discipline, but in other disciplines as well, as we touch all these different medical specialties. And ideally, it's also where these issues are debated in the letters to the editor or the correspondence sections of the journal. And I want to talk a little bit more about that with IJOP. But it's really one of the key elements of how the profession moves forward. And so participating in that through scholarly publication, participating in the conversations after an article is published, I think are all really important hallmarks of making this a profession and moving things forward.
So, Mic, I firmly and fundamentally agree with you, actually, and I think it forms the basis, robust empirical research, and indeed expert opinion and everything in between. It starts to move the profession forwards in a number of ways, really. But could we just maybe look at your career pathway a little bit? Could you unpack your background for us?
Sure. Owen, I have a rather unusual background, I guess, by many people's standards. I actually never went to paramedic school or EMT school. I started out in the 70s, trained as a military medic for the U.S. Army. And when I got out of the Army in the 70s, things were still very, very new, unformed. And so I qualified for what was called a grandfather clause. I had military training and experience in pre-hospital care through the military. And so I was allowed to just sit for the state examination after taking one of the very early ACLS courses from the American Heart Association, and had an affidavit signed by a local ambulance medical director saying that I had performed a certain number of IVs and defibrillations and stuff, and so that's how I got my paramedic credentials. So after a few years, working in civilian EMS in that capacity, I decided to try to further my education, so I started going to college and got a job on campus working at the medical school. And it was in the Department of Surgery in an oxygen transport physiology lab. And they did a lot of animal studies there, and I had a chance to really learn how to do surgery. Working with the surgical residents and the fellows, and doing these different research studies. And I just fell in love with academic medicine. But the funny thing, though, Owen, was I noticed that the coin of the realm around the medical school was publishing in peer-reviewed journals. And so I remember, I was working with the chairman of the Department of Surgery, who was the guy who ran the lab. And I said, well, what's the peer-reviewed journal for EMS? And he just started laughing. Emergency medicine itself wasn't even accepted as a specialty yet here in the States. And so, EMS research was just virtually non-existent. But I was just learning so much in that lab about things that were relevant to me as a paramedic out in the field. And I just really wanted to try to move that forward. And a few years later, down the hallway from our lab, there was an engineer who had this new computer called a Macintosh, and it could do page layout. And so I decided to start a peer-reviewed EMS journal, and that was the Tampa Bay EMS Journal. I was living in Tampa, Florida at the time, and just got some faculty from the medical school and some of the local medical directors to be on my editorial board, and we just started doing it. After a year, it became the Journal of Pre-Hospital Medicine, went national, so I recruited a broader range of people in the EMS discipline at that point. And it caught the attention of the organization that was just starting then, the National Association of EMS Physicians. And the president was a guy by the name of Ron Stewart, who was in Pittsburgh at the time. And down the hallway from him was Peter Saffer, which is a name you may recognize, world famous resuscitation researcher, the guy behind the Freedom House ambulance service, developed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and glued it together with chest compressions to start CPR. The list just goes on of Dr. Saffer's accomplishments. He and R. Adams Cowley, the guy at Maryland Shock Trauma, who started the first trauma center, they were working together to publish something called the Journal for the World Association for Disaster and Emergency Medicine. So the plan was NEMSP and WADM were going to work together and do a single journal. And then they saw my journal come out, and I kind of beat them to the punch. So we had some conversations. They kind of co-opted me into working with them. And that's what started Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine, which is still published today by Cambridge Press. So that's still going strong, but that was kind of the origin story. And so with that trajectory of my career, I got a little bit more exposure, had a chance to start working full time for my local medical director, got really interested in quality management, ended up getting recruited by a national ambulance company to be their national director for research, quality, and education. And I found that quality management was an area where I couldn't get EMS research grants because, again, there just wasn't any significant activity, much less grant money there. But I could use the skills I learned in research to do quality management. And so that's kind of been my specialty focus. And so along the way, I have done consulting, teaching quality management, got recruited by the American Heart Association to be their national director for clinical systems, and ran a program called Mission Lifeline for a while. Did some work as an EMS administrator, a lot of different roles in my career. I've just had a blast, just doing what I love to do. I don't know how else to put it, Owen.
Mick, that's fantastic, and like you said, possibly followed your passion through the sort of trajectory of your career as well, which is fantastic. Could I get you to speak to the inception and vision for the International Journal of Paramedicine, and I guess rolling two questions into one. Once you sort of speak to the inception and vision for it, could you also maybe just then speak about the scope and aims of the journal?
Sure. So obviously there are EMS journals around, right? Pre-hospital and disaster medicine, pre-hospital emergency care from NEMSP kind of spun off from that. Uh, the Australasian Journal of Paramedicine, now just called Paramedicine, a number of other venues. But where I saw a gap is that there isn't a lot of non-clinical research being published. And I think there's a broader range of scholarship that we should try to encourage within our discipline outside of research per se. Um, for example, in business, I like reading the Harvard Business Review, and HBR has a lot of scholarly discourse in it that isn't, necessarily about research. They'll have a current issue in business, and they'll have titans of industry along with people from academia discussing, these different issues from their respective perspectives. And it's a great form of synthesis, in my opinion. So part of the vision for the journal is to have this broader range of scholarly dialogue surrounding our profession, not just about clinical interventions, but operations, management, finance, etc. How do all these pieces fit together? And the other thing is, with this being an international journal, I'm hoping that we can start learning from each other, because I think we have a tendency to just kind of look at the space immediately around our ambulance or our system. And I think it's a shame that we don't really benefit from the knowledge and experience of other systems. And a good example of that is I had an opportunity to work with people in South America where they use the Franco-Germanic model of using physicians on ambulances. But it's in a for-profit model, and it was fascinating in that, for the price of a pack of cigarettes, you can purchase ambulance coverage for your household. And it kind of includes like a physician house call element. And it was that model that kind of inspired my medical director, a guy by the name of Joe Ryan, and Sandy Kuehl, who is the EMS medical director in New York City, to kind of think of this idea of expanded scope of practice, which has subsequently evolved into paramedicine or community paramedicine here in the States after removal of some economic barriers and political resistance to the idea. But the people in South America, Argentina and Uruguay in particular, had been doing it for a very long time. And it just illustrates that there's so much we can learn from each other and the diverse ways in which different nations and communities of practice have tried to basically crack the same nut in different ways. And so that's what I want to tap into with the journal is how do we enrich the profession through the diversity of all the different ways that EMS is practiced around the world.
That's fantastic, Mick. And like you said, what it does is it lends itself to the scope and aim really being quite wide in some terms because it captures very different systems, very different, like you said, models of operating, and hopefully priorities because each geographical location will have different empirical priorities according to their need, according to pathology. So it sounds like it will showcase and does showcase a vast array of research, but also to your point, and I really like what you said here about getting shared situation awareness from aspects outside of pre-hospital care because I listen to a number of podcasts, some of which are medical, some of which aren't, and I just really appreciate really well thought through interviews, really well thought through questions. I appreciate a certain level of critical analysis, and that doesn't have to be pre-hospital care. It might be political analysis, it might be socioeconomic analysis, but it's what it is. It's insight. It's that insight. It's that next level of insight and detail, which like you said, kind of transcends boundaries from the medical realms of content production. So I very much agree with you, and I'm in concordance with that. But could you speak to something, because I think the way you're approaching the journal is fascinating in a way, because I think we've spoken offline and elsewhere about that you want to explore parts and indeed realms and domains that don't currently exist to sort of appeal to a wider readership. Could you maybe expand on some of the exploration to domains that don't currently exist within historical journals?
Sure. So, one of the areas that I'd like to explore is uh, academic debate. So, take a controversial issue and let's get the appropriate subject matter experts together and have good, uh, healthy academic scholarly conversation to reveal different perspectives about the issues and let the readers benefit from hearing those different perspectives. It's great synthesis of content. So, one of the things I want to do at the journal is not limit ourselves to the printed page. First of all, we're not printed, it's electronic, but I want to embrace that rather than view it as a disadvantage because a lot of people have said, oh, bemoaning the fact that, some of the print journals or print versions of the journals have gone away. I see it as a huge advantage because what I'd like to see journals do and that I want to do with iJob is expand the reach of the journal. So we want to interview authors and give them an opportunity to basically give their oral abstract like they would present at a scientific conference, but do that through the journal, and then have an interview with the journal authors and have a conversation about their work, and again invite in other subject matter experts. Post that to YouTube, and then in the message threads below the YouTube video itself, have that conversation continue. Curate that conversation and put that into the quote unquote letters to the editor section of the journal. Even though it wasn't submitted as a letter, it's from comments from LinkedIn, from YouTube, Instagram, wherever we happen to be posting the content, and curate that and give that as a mechanism for people to start having their thoughts and opinions and perspectives uh, actually appear in the content of the journal itself. So there's the academic debate. We want to start publishing performance metric definitions. So, how do we measure how well EMS works? Are those performance metrics, and those frequently drive an awful lot of operational and financial decisions, sets public expectations. But we don't do a whole lot in publication about publishing the metrics and having conversations about the inclusion and exclusion criteria and the way that the data is presented. So again, it'll be a way for particularly non-academically affiliated ambulance services to participate in scholarly activities with publication of their performance indicator definitions with all of the granularity, ideally some pseudocode that would be used by software people to translate that into business rules and writing the software. Uh, there's there's just so many different sections that we could start discussing, Owen. But in the guidelines for authors section of the journal website, all these different sections are explained. But let it suffice to say that publishing empirical research is one of probably over a dozen different categories of manuscripts that we're really looking to do and significantly differentiate what iJob does versus the traditional peer-reviewed research journals.
That's fantastic, Mick. And like you said, what it just does is removes the barrier to entry. Well, hopefully maintaining a baseline of civil conversation and indeed academic conversation, and it can include opinion, but hopefully, backed by research. But also just, yeah, it's I'm learning to this as well about being able to disagree agreeably, and not everyone has to agree, but it's in due course in that civil manner that you can do that, but also removing the barrier to entry and actually finding people where they are, fundamentally finding people on LinkedIn, finding people on YouTube, and indeed other platforms where by you can start to orchestrate these conversations, and remove the tension points from having to submit a formal manuscript, academic manuscript. That is actually going to be my next question, because I think, like you said, it's good to diversify. It's good to have a backbone and of maybe that formal manuscript submission, but also diversify into many different kind of areas. Could you maybe speak to the process of handling manuscripts from more of a formal academic submission? What's the process if someone wanted to publish?
Sure. So for a formal manuscript submission, whether it's empirical research or in one of these other categories, um, in general, we try to follow what are called equator guidelines. And the equator is a group of international consensus standards on how a case report should be structured, a quality improvement report should be structured, uh, a literature synthesis, different types of manuscripts are all described in these different equator guidelines. And it just gives you a very step-by-step checklist and framework for writing those manuscripts. And so it's helpful from both the author's perspective as well as the editorial perspective of the journal, so that the variable is not the structure of the document, the variable is the work itself. And so it takes a lot of that guesswork away and gives you something to follow. But once the manuscript is received, our workflow is myself and my managing editor, Mike Touchstone. We initially review the manuscripts and see if they're in scope. Is it related to paramedicine? You'd be surprised. We get some stuff that just, I don't know why they submitted it to us, but nonetheless, we'll reject it at that point if it's really not relevant and if it's of reasonable quality. And if it's of reasonable quality, it's in scope, then does it have the required elements for submission? There is, certain things of disclosing any conflicts of interest and just a number of different structural elements that needs to be part of the submission. So if it has all of those necessary elements, then we will enter it into peer review. It gets assigned to one of our associate editors, who essentially works as a project manager, and they will assign the peer reviewers. We try to assign at least 3, typically more, because oftentimes one of the reviewers will, have a busy schedule and won't be able to get their review done on time. So we try to have at least 3. So we'll sometimes assign, 4, 5, or 6 reviewers sometimes to a single article in hopes of getting 3 back in a timely manner. And each of the reviewers has a structured form that they complete that asks them to opine on the title, the abstract, the materials and methods, the methods of analysis. And there's different checklists for different types of manuscripts. And then they also have a Likert scale rating, 1 to 5, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is designed to meet 2 objectives. One, appropriately screen the manuscript so that good work is what's published ultimately in the journal. And second is to give constructive feedback to the author to help strengthen their manuscript. Our objective is not to be critical for the sake of being critical and rejecting manuscripts that we don't like. What we like to approach this is, how can we help the author improve their work? And sometimes if they've already collected their data and everything, you might not be able to salvage it without redoing the entire study, unfortunately. But sometimes there are ways you can rework your data or, reconsider it in a different way and still salvage the manuscript. So we want to do as much as we can to help authors move forward, particularly newer authors. And that's part of the reality, is because we're a new journal, we don't get a lot of the more established authors submitting to us. We tend to get more of the younger investigators. but that's going to change as we get indexed, et cetera, and our journal matures. So for the time being, we're really trying to help nurture newer authors or people who are publishing work that just isn't finding open arms with the other journals because it might not be a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical intervention study, which is, the typical things that most journals publish. So if you're outside of that realm, please consider, publishing with iJob.
I really agree with a lot of what you said there, actually, Mick, and I think it's fascinating to see, like you said, you sort of helping authors and helping people start to encourage them to publish, but also to guide them along the path and just in that iterative process. And you've spoken to the peer review process. You've also spoken indeed about sort of the clarity of language and indeed the submission itself. Could you maybe speak to sort of any formatting generic guidelines that you would advocate, and or also indeed any copyright? Is there anything that researchers should be mindful of regarding copyright?
Sure. So the formatting is pretty standard. I mean, we want to get it in Microsoft Word format, with line numbering and, all that sort of dry stuff, which we don't need to get into now. But beyond that, with the copyright issues, it's important for your listeners to note that this is an open access journal. One of the barriers to reading a lot of peer-reviewed literature is the articles are behind paywalls. You can maybe read the abstract, but you can't read the full manuscript. That is not the case with International Journal of Paramedicine. It is completely open access. And in doing so, we use Creative Commons licensure, just like Wikipedia does. And so there's Creative Commons licensure, which shares the copyright between the authors and the National EMS Management Association through the journal. So you're free to use the content in other ways that you deem necessary. We didn't want to put up any barriers over those sorts of issues to people trying to publish their work.
And people that do publish, could you maybe speak to ways in which they can garner more exposure and indeed in coverage of their publication? Because I think getting a publication over line is one thing, certainly from an iterative process, but then bringing attention to that and publishing and getting almost marketing and exposure of that publication is an entire another thing. Could you maybe speak to what you suggest authors do to garner more attention to their publication?
Well, they've got to leverage social media. That's where the audience is. That's just the reality. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality. And so that's why we want to do these different formats associated with the journal. So, we're just trying to do, to use an American football metaphor, basic blocking and tackling right now with the journal. But what we're trying to move towards is asking authors to submit a video abstract as well as their written abstract, so it can be posted on YouTube. For articles, we want to highlight into the limits of the bandwidth of our all volunteer staff. I should note we've got about 150 people involved with the journal, all volunteers, production, page layout, copy editing, peer review, all of it, all volunteers from all over the world. And but we want to do the podcast interviews of the authors. And then, as I mentioned, with the correspondence section, use that to facilitate conversations about the work. And we're going to invite other subject matter experts into the conversation in those message threads. And that's where there's going to be those opportunities for people at the tip of the spear, working directly on the front line, on actual ambulances, running actual communication centers, managing actual EMS systems outside of the ivory towers of academic institutions, where they'll have the opportunity to directly participate in those conversations. It's one thing to publish a research study, say, about emergency medical dispatch and pre-arrival instructions and look at it from, a very analytical standpoint as a university professor may do. But it's an entirely different perspective talking to a person who actually does this, as their primary work, 8, 10, 12-hour shifts, doing pre-arrival instructions, and comment on that paper about their craft. And that also brings up another interesting point that's a little bit different about our journal. I have been actively recruiting people onto the editorial team that are not academicians, that are people at the tip of the spear, so that when I send an article out to peer review, it's not just academicians that are looking at it, it is other fellow practitioners in different roles and responsibilities in the system that are also participating in the peer review. They might not be able to comment conclusively about the nuances of the statistical methods, but we have statistics and methods reviewers to do that. But I do want to get that real world perspective of people who actually do the job and give them a voice in how the science and art and craft of paramedicine evolves.
Mick, this is fascinating, and I just read a fantastic Wall Street journal. But actually, it wasn't a Wall Street journal. It was a Harvard Business Review, actually, on old power and new power, and how old power really demonstrates that there is a real bottleneck in publication because old power constitutes power resides in the hands of a few. They really filter and get to decide what's published, whereas new power is far more democratized. It sits within the fingertips of everybody. You can podcasts are a classic example of this, and one of the things you said about translating the written content to audio content and indeed visual content is that it's bringing, and partly the whole ethos of what you're saying in this interview is bringing the power back to the readership, the listenership, the engaging audience, that they can, and dropping the barrier to entry for paramedics, for pre-hospital clinicians to publish and to get published in a variety of different ways, and or just interact with the journal. And new power from this Harvard Business Review was just really illustrating that it is this fundamental shift in the fact that actually everyone is a creator of content. Everyone can be a co-creator or indeed a creator of content. And it's now the old institutions have to pivot, and if they don't, they get left behind. And I think one of the things I really like about what you're saying is that the journal really is bridging that gap, that you're meeting people where they are on social media and other places. You're producing content in audio format. You're translating content to far more consumable mediums that people can actually engage with. And actually, what that's doing, it's bridging this old power, new power kind of concept, whereby it's, you can consume it on the drive home after your 12-hour shift or on the way to work before your 12-hour shift. So you can listen to something, you can still consume information without having to sit down and read, because reading, it's still fundamentally useful, but there's a lot of entropy, there's a lot of lost time and effort. It's very intentional, and it's how you engage with the journal over multimedia purposes to really garner that kind of engagement, which I find absolutely fascinating and fundamentally agree with. And it's the premise I started this podcast on, is that actually the medium is shifting from the written word to the spoken word, very much so. And if you can engage with both, all the better, for blogs and indeed for academic publications, but also with rigorous audio content, which is educational as well. So I just want to say I fundamentally agree with the multimodal strategy you're employing with the journal, just to capture that audience base. And I think it's a fascinating pivot.
Yeah, and we mentioned, lowering the barrier, an important distinction. It's the ability to access and participate. It's not about lowering the quality barrier. We still want to preserve very high quality content and discourse, which is why that content on those social media platforms will be curated by the editorial team before it appears, in printed word, if you will, electronic print, uh, and indexed, et cetera, in the journal. So we want to maintain a very high level of conversation around it, but unlike a lot of the stuff you see on social media, we want to employ a lot of discipline in that conversation so that we don't have a lot of the noise and drivel and, you know, just noise. I don't know how else to politely describe it, but we all know what I'm talking about. The sort of trolling and stuff that goes on sometimes in the social media platforms. That's just not going to be allowed. We will have moderation on those discussion threads to filter that sort of stuff out.
So, Mick, as we come into land on the conversation, just if I could just ask you maybe for a few final words, we are going to link the journal in the show notes because I would love for people to engage with the International Journal of Paramedicine and indeed to publish through the journal. And so we will link it in the show notes and indeed elsewhere. But could you maybe just speak a final few words, indeed take home points to listeners about engagement with the journal and indeed publication?
Yeah, first of all, I mentioned that we have a fairly large team now, but uh, we've started getting a flood of manuscripts in, Owen, which is a wonderful problem to have. But I'm having to upscale our processes. So I'm really looking for more people to help us with the journal and become part of the journal team. And like I mentioned, you don't have to have your PhD, to participate in this. So if you are of a more academic, critical thinking mindset and would like to get into a little bit more academic, scholarly perspective in your career trajectory, uh, and particularly if you have some skills with podcasting, video production, page layout, uh, you know, copy editing, etc., we're really looking for people who are EMS paramedicine professionals to do those tasks rather than, people with generic skills in those areas. Because again, we're all volunteer, so I want people to be doing this because they're passionate about trying to contribute towards the academic and professional development of paramedicine. So there's opportunities there. So people, I would encourage you to reach out if this sounds like something that would be of interest to you. Um, we're looking for more help. We've described a very ambitious agenda here, and we're only about 5%, I would say, into the journey with the video and the audio and all of this stuff. We need some more bandwidth in terms of people. So I'm hoping that through the broad readership of this program, we might be able to find more people, particularly outside of the United States. It started here, so it's a little bit U.S. centric, but I want to fulfill the vision of the journal to be truly an international venue for the evolution of the art, science, and craft of paramedicine.
Listen, mate, that's fantastic. And I will put a contact detail informed and given to me by yourself that people can reach out just so that they can get involved. But listen, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been truly insightful and it's been great just to get your perspective. So thank you, Mick.
Thank you, Owen.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.